This is the second Oscar for Brad Pitt, his first for acting.
Thank you to the Academy for this honor of honors. They told me I only have 45 seconds up here.
There is a kind of success that never tells you when to stop. It rewards momentum. It praises endurance. It convinces you that slowing down is dangerous, because everything you've built might disappear the moment you pause. In that world, rest feels like risk, and silence feels like failure. So you keep moving. Hollywood is especially good at celebrating this behavior. It turns productivity into identity. It frames constant motion as discipline. And it quietly ignores what happens when the pace outgrows the person carrying it. Some careers are built on talent, some on timing, and some on never giving yourself space to fall apart. From the outside, certain lives look effortless. Iconic roles, decades of relevance, admiration that never fully fades. But effortlessness is often just exhaustion that learned how to hide. When someone is always working, always visible, always pushing forward, it's easy to assume they're fine. That success has stabilized them. That momentum has solved whatever problems existed underneath. But momentum doesn't solve anything. It delays it. Addiction thrives in that delay. Not always loudly, not always visibly. Sometimes it hides inside routine, inside discipline, inside the idea that staying busy is the same as staying in control. Fame makes this easier to miss, because fame rewards the appearance of stability while amplifying pressure behind the scenes. It offers endless distraction, endless access, endless validation, none of which replace rest, honesty, or self-awareness. Some people slow down before the cost becomes clear. Others don't realize what they're running from until everything stops. This is not a story about scandal or collapse. It's about what happens when success keeps accelerating while the inner life is left behind. About how addiction can coexist with achievement. And about the price paid when slowing down feels more frightening than continuing. Once you understand that cost, Brad Pitt's story looks very different. Brad Pitt's career trained him to stay in motion long before anyone questioned the cost. From early success onward, momentum became the rule. Each film led to another. Each reinvention fed the next. There was no natural pause, no expectation that he should stop and assess what the pace was doing to him internally. Hollywood doesn't reward reflection, it rewards output. For someone like Pitt, whose presence alone could anchor projects, slowing down felt irresponsible. Not just professionally, but personally. When you are depended on, by studios, by crews, by an image larger than yourself, rest starts to feel like abandonment. You learn to keep going even when something inside you is asking for space. This is where the danger begins. Because constant motion creates cover. It hides discomfort behind schedules. It turns exhaustion into normalcy. It allows unresolved emotions to sit quietly in the background while life looks productive from the outside. And the longer that pattern holds, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between discipline and avoidance. Pitt's public image reinforced this dynamic. He was framed as effortless, adaptable, endlessly capable. Roles shifted, aesthetics evolved, relevance never really dipped. From the outside, it looked like control. From the inside, it demanded continuous self-regulation without recovery. Recovery requires stillness. Stillness was never built into the system. Addiction does not always begin as excess. Often it begins as management. Something that takes the edge off without disrupting function. Something that fits neatly around work, success, and responsibility. Something that doesn't immediately demand attention. When life never slows down, there is no space to notice when coping turns into dependence. For Pitt, the culture around him normalized intensity. Long shoots, long nights. Social environments where excess was framed as creative fuel or release. When everyone around you is operating at the same speed, warning signs blend into background noise. And fame amplifies that noise. Fame insulates people from immediate consequences. You can be struggling internally while everything externally continues to work. Projects succeed, appearances land, praise continues. This creates a dangerous disconnect between inner reality and outer feedback. The world keeps telling you you're fine. Your body and mind know otherwise. But listening to that internal signal requires slowing down enough to hear it. Pitt didn't. Not because he was reckless, but because the structure of his life didn't allow it. Momentum became identity. Stopping felt like losing control. This is the paradox of high-functioning addiction. You don't fall apart right away. You perform. You show up. You deliver. You stay relevant. And because you're performing, no one intervenes. There's nothing obvious to fix. The system continues to reward you, which reinforces the behavior. The cycle tightens. For years, Pitt existed inside that cycle. Work moved forward. Public life continued. Private strain accumulated. The gap between who he was publicly and what he was managing privately widened. That gap creates isolation. Not isolation from people, but from honesty. When everything around you depends on stability, admitting instability feels threatening. You don't want to disappoint. You don't want to disrupt. You don't want to be the problem in a machine that relies on your reliability. So you keep going. This is where addiction quietly deepens. It becomes a way to self-regulate in an environment that never slows down for reflection. It fills the spaces where rest should exist. It dulls signals that would otherwise force change. Change is disruptive. Continuity is rewarded. Brad Pitt's image as a leading man, a creative force, a symbol of enduring relevance, made continuity feel essential. Stepping back would have challenged not just his schedule, but the narrative built around him. Narratives are heavy things to carry when they're profitable. The public rarely sees this pressure. We assume success creates freedom. In reality, it often creates obligation. The more successful you are, the more people depend on your consistency. And consistency at that scale requires suppression of fatigue, doubt, and sometimes pain. Over time, suppression becomes habit. Habits don't announce themselves as problems. They integrate. They become routine. They hide inside professionalism. And because the external markers of success remain intact, there is no obvious moment of collapse to trigger concern. Until there is. But collapse is not the only endpoint. Sometimes the cost shows up differently, in strained relationships, in emotional distance, in a growing sense that life is being managed rather than lived. These are quieter signals, easy to ignore when work keeps moving. Pitt's life reflected that quiet imbalance. Public admiration continued. Private life grew more complicated. The pace never adjusted to accommodate what was happening internally. This is the cost of never slowing down. Not an immediate crash, but a gradual erosion of self-awareness. When every day is structured, there is no time to ask why you're doing any of it. When every moment is filled, there is no space to feel what you're avoiding. Addiction thrives in full calendars. It convinces you that you're functioning because you are productive, that you're stable because you're successful, that nothing needs to change because nothing has stopped working. Yet, Brad Pitt's story at this stage is not about failure. It's about misalignment, a life that continued accelerating while the inner world lagged behind, a career that demanded endurance without offering recovery, and endurance without pause is unsustainable. The cost does not always appear where people expect it. It doesn't always arrive as scandal or visible breakdown. Sometimes it shows up as disconnection, as numbness, as a growing distance from the person you are when you're not performing. That distance was building quietly. And the longer it went unaddressed, the more expensive slowing down would eventually become. As the years passed, the pace that once felt exhilarating began to feel compulsory. What started as ambition hardened into momentum that could not be questioned. Brad Pitt wasn't just moving fast, he was moving because stopping had become unfamiliar. When a life is built around forward motion, stillness feels threatening. Stillness invites reflection, reflection invites recognition. And recognition can force change. For someone whose identity had been reinforced by productivity for decades, change felt destabilizing. Work provided structure, public admiration provided validation, routine provided insulation. Without them, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable when you've spent years being certain of your role. This is where addiction often deepens, not as chaos, but as control. Addiction becomes a private regulator, a way to manage emotions without disrupting performance. It allows you to keep showing up while numbing signals that something is wrong. From the outside, nothing appears broken. From the inside, awareness dulls. Pitt existed in an environment where excess was normalized. Creative circles often romanticize intensity. Long nights are framed as passion. escapism is framed as release. When these patterns are socially reinforced, it becomes difficult to identify where choice ends and compulsion begins. And because the work never stopped, there was no forced reckoning. Success continued to arrive. Films were made, praise followed, the public image remained intact. That consistency sent a dangerous message. Whatever you're doing, it's working. And when external feedback stays positive, internal warnings are easier to ignore. This is the illusion of stability. Real stability allows for rest. Illusory stability requires constant motion. Over time, the emotional cost surfaced in subtler ways. Relationships strained under the weight of absence, distraction, and emotional unavailability. Being physically present is not the same as being engaged. Addiction doesn't always isolate you from people. It isolates you within interactions. You're there, but you're not fully reachable. That distance accumulates. Small moments of disconnection become patterns. Conversations become shallow. Conflicts linger unresolved. The gap between who you are publicly and who you are privately widens, creating a sense of fragmentation. Fragmentation is exhausting. To hold multiple versions of yourself, professional, public, private, without integration, requires constant effort. Something has to give. Often, it's honesty. With others. With yourself. This is why slowing down is so threatening. It collapses those compartments, it forces alignment. And alignment exposes contradictions you've learned to manage instead of address. For Pitt, slowing down meant confronting years of deferred reflection. It meant acknowledging that momentum had protected him, but it had also prevented growth in certain areas. It meant recognizing that success had become a buffer against self-examination. That realization doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives in moments of discomfort, in feedback that lands harder than expected, in relationships that can't sustain the distance anymore. These moments signal that the cost of never slowing down is no longer theoretical. It's lived. At some point, motion stops being a solution and becomes the problem. The hardest part is that nothing external forces the pause. There's no collapse to justify it. No obvious failure. The world still rewards you. The system still works. And walking away from that requires courage most people don't associate with success. Because stepping back looks like risk. And risk feels irresponsible when everything depends on you continuing. This is the trap of high-functioning success. You are praised for enduring conditions that quietly erode you. You are rewarded for resilience that is actually avoidance. And by the time the need for change becomes undeniable, the habit of motion is deeply ingrained. Pitt reached that crossroads gradually, not through a single breaking point, but through accumulation. Through the realization that the life he was maintaining required more numbing than awareness, more management than presence, more escape than engagement. Addiction did not define him. But it revealed something important. It revealed what happens when a person never gives themselves permission to stop. When slowing down feels more dangerous than continuing, when the cost of rest seems higher than the cost of exhaustion, that realization began shifting something fundamental. Because once you see the price of constant motion, you can't unsee it. And once you acknowledge that addiction has been filling the space where rest and reflection should have existed, the pace you once relied on becomes impossible to sustain. This is where the story turns, not toward collapse, but toward confrontation. Confrontation with habits that once protected you, confrontation with the parts of yourself you outran, confrontation with the truth that slowing down is not failure, it is necessity. And that confrontation would force Brad Pitt to face something far more difficult than public scrutiny: himself. When the momentum finally slowed enough to notice, what emerged was not chaos, but clarity. And clarity can be more unsettling than collapse. Collapse gives you an explanation. Clarity gives you responsibility. Brad Pitt began to see that the pace he had normalized was not neutral. It had shaped how he related to himself, to others, and to time itself. Years of constant motion had trained him to live reactively, responding to schedules, roles, expectations, rather than intentionally. Intentional living requires presence. Presence had been postponed. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They assume change happens when things fall apart. In reality, change often begins when things almost fall apart, When the cost becomes visible, but the system is still intact, that's when choice becomes unavoidable. For Pitt, the realization was not that success had failed him, it was that success had protected him from asking questions he should have asked earlier. Who am I when I'm not working? What am I avoiding by staying busy? What parts of myself never developed because there was no time? These questions don't arrive politely. They disrupt routines. They challenge identities built on competence and reliability. When you've been valued for decades because you deliver, questioning delivery feels like threatening your own worth. This is why slowing down feels dangerous. It threatens the structure that held everything together. Addiction often sits at the center of this structure because it provides continuity when internal coherence is missing. It helps maintain function without requiring reevaluation. But once awareness returns, that role collapses. What once felt like support starts feeling like obstruction. That shift is uncomfortable. Sobriety, or any meaningful change, doesn't just remove a behavior, it removes a coping mechanism. And when that mechanism has been filling space left by rest, reflection, or emotional processing, its absence is loud. Silence returns. Silence forces reckoning. Pitt began confronting emotions he had managed indirectly for years. Anger that had nowhere to land, disappointment that had been deferred, sadness that had been smoothed over by motion. These emotions weren't new. They were simply unprocessed. Processing them required time. Time required slowing down. Slowing down required letting go of control. Control had been his survival skill. Hollywood rewards control over image, performance, narrative. Pitt had mastered that. But internal control is different. It requires allowing discomfort without numbing it, allowing uncertainty without immediately resolving it, allowing vulnerability without turning it into productivity. This is where relationships became a mirror. Patterns that had been sustained by distraction became visible. Distance that had been excused by schedules was no longer invisible. Emotional availability, or the lack of it, could no longer be explained away by work. When the noise quiets, dynamics surface. That surfacing can feel like loss, even when it's necessary. Loss of familiar rhythms. Loss of identity anchored in busyness. Loss of the version of yourself who always knew what came next. Pitt faced that loss without the protection of constant distraction. This is the real cost of never slowing down. When you finally do, everything you postponed shows up at once. But this stage is not about punishment, it's about integration. Integration means reconciling the parts of yourself that developed at different speeds. The public figure who matured under scrutiny. The private self that matured under pressure. The emotional self that was delayed because there was no time. Integration is slow. It doesn't produce dramatic moments, it produces quieter days. Fewer commitments. More listening than speaking. Less urgency to prove relevance. More willingness to sit with discomfort. This shift changed how Pitt approached work. Projects were no longer just opportunities, they were environments. Would this work support balance or disrupt it? Would it require constant promotion or allow distance? Would it add meaning or simply extend momentum? These questions replaced earlier metrics. This doesn't mean ambition disappeared, it changed shape. Ambition became sustainability, longevity without erosion, creativity without self-abandonment. That recalibration often looks like decline from the outside. Fewer appearances, longer gaps, less noise, but internally, it represents alignment between capacity and choice. Alignment is what constant motion prevents. Another consequence emerged here: humility. When you stop using success as insulation, you are forced to see yourself without it. Not as an icon, not as a leading man, but as a person with limits. Accepting those limits without resentment is difficult, especially when your identity was built on exceeding them. Pitt had to learn that limits are not failures. They are information. Information about what can be sustained. Information about what must change. Information about where growth was delayed. This reframing is subtle but profound. It transforms slowing down from a threat into a tool, a way to gather data instead of avoid it. Over time, the urge to outrun discomfort weakened. Not because life became easier, but because awareness replaced avoidance. Addiction lost its function when presence returned. Presence is demanding. It offers no shortcuts. But it restores agency. Agency is the opposite of momentum. Momentum carries you forward whether you're ready or not. Agency asks you to choose direction consciously, even when the choice is slower. Pitt began choosing slower. Not retreating from life, but entering it differently. Less reactive. Less driven by external pace. More responsive to internal signals that had been muted for years. This is not the part of the story people celebrate. There are no trophies for choosing rest. No applause for emotional integration. But this is where lives stabilize. Without this phase, success remains fragile. With it, success becomes livable. Brad Pitt's journey here is not about redemption or reinvention, it's about recalibration after decades of acceleration, about discovering that slowing down doesn't end a life, it makes one possible. And this recalibration sets the stage for the final question his story raises. What does success mean when speed is no longer the measure, and what is gained when a life finally matches its pace? By the time Brad Pitt reached this phase of his life, slowing down was no longer a temporary adjustment. It became a permanent recalibration. Not a pause before returning to the same pace, but a decision to live differently inside the same world. This distinction matters. Many people slow down because they are forced to. Few slow down because they understand something fundamental has to change. Pitt's shift was rooted in understanding. Not fear of collapse, but recognition of cost. The cost was not just addiction, it was disconnection. Disconnection from emotional immediacy, from relationships that require presence rather than performance, from a sense of time that allows reflection instead of constant anticipation. Years of acceleration had flattened experience. Moments passed without being fully inhabited. Slowing down brought those moments back. And with them came discomfort. When life is no longer filled end to end, you begin to notice what you've been avoiding. Regret surfaces, not as dramatic remorse, but as quiet awareness. Awareness of things missed, conversations rushed, feelings postponed, versions of yourself that never had room to emerge. This awareness is heavy, but it is also clarifying. Pitt began to understand that never slowing down had protected him from vulnerability as much as it had fueled success. Constant motion had been a defense, a way to avoid sitting still long enough for unresolved emotions to demand attention. Addiction had fit neatly into that defense. When the pace slowed, the need for that defense weakened. But what replaced it was not ease. It was responsibility. Responsibility to feel without numbing. To respond rather than react. To choose presence over productivity. Presence is demanding. It requires listening instead of escaping. It requires honesty instead of performance. It requires patience in a culture trained for immediacy. This shift altered how Pitt related to work. Projects were no longer distractions from life. They had to coexist with it. That meant fewer commitments, clearer boundaries, and an acceptance that relevance might fluctuate. Fluctuation stopped feeling like failure. Earlier in his career, momentum had been synonymous with safety. If things were moving, everything was fine. Now, safety was defined differently. Safety meant stability, predictability of routine, space for relationships, time that was not pre-assigned. This new definition of safety reshaped priorities. Work became part of life instead of its structure. Identity loosened from output. Self-worth stopped being measured by visibility. These changes sound subtle, but for someone whose life had been publicly validated for decades, they were radical. Radical because they removed external pressure as the primary driver. Another consequence of slowing down was exposure to uncertainty. Without constant projects filling the horizon, the future looked less scripted. For someone accustomed to knowing what came next, that uncertainty was uncomfortable. But it was also honest. Uncertainty forced Pitt to engage with the present rather than outrun it. To experience days without immediate payoff. To sit with not knowing instead of filling the gap with activity. This is where many people revert. They speed up again. They seek distraction. They rebuild momentum because uncertainty feels like loss of control. Pitt did not. He allowed uncertainty to exist. Allowing uncertainty does not mean surrender. It means trust. Trust that identity can survive without constant reinforcement. Trust that relevance does not disappear the moment you stop feeding it. trust that a life can be meaningful without being relentlessly productive. This trust is learned, not assumed. It comes from seeing that slowing down does not erase you, it reveals you. As the noise quieted, Pitt became more aware of how fame had shaped his instincts. The reflex to perform stability, the impulse to manage perception, the habit of prioritizing image over internal coherence. Slowing down weakened those reflexes. Without constant public engagement, there was less need to curate, less pressure to maintain a narrative, less incentive to hide complexity. Life became less legible to others and more honest to himself. This honesty affected relationships most of all. Presence changed the quality of interaction. Listening replaced multitasking. Engagement replaced availability. The difference is subtle but profound. Being available means you show up. Being present means you're actually there. Years of acceleration had prioritized the former. Slowing down allowed the latter. This is where the cost of never slowing down becomes fully visible. Not in the damage done, but in what was delayed. Emotional fluency, relational depth, self-knowledge. These are not luxuries. They are foundations. Foundations that can be built late, but not without effort. Pitt's life at this stage was no longer about outrunning consequences. It was about integrating them, accepting that success achieved at high speed carries residue. And that residue must be addressed intentionally if life is to feel whole. This integration is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in choices made quietly, in schedules that leave space, in boundaries held without explanation, in a willingness to be less impressive and more present. The industry does not celebrate this phase. There are no awards for slowing down, no recognition for choosing less, no applause for emotional repair. But this phase determines whether success becomes sustainable or remains a performance. Brad Pitt's story here is not about withdrawal. It is about re-entry into life as it is, rather than life as it is managed, into relationships as they are, rather than as they are maintained, into self-awareness without the buffer of constant motion. This re-entry does not erase the past. It gives it context. And it prepares the ground for the final reflection his journey leads to, not about addiction alone, but about what it means to live well after a life spent running at full speed. In the end, Brad Pitt's story is not defined by fame or addiction alone. It is defined by speed, and by what happens when a life moves faster than the person living it. For decades, success rewarded his momentum. Productivity was praised, endurance was expected, the ability to keep going became evidence of strength. But strength, when never questioned, can turn into avoidance. And momentum, when never interrupted, can become a trap. What addiction revealed was not weakness. It revealed what constant motion had been protecting him from. Slowing down forced awareness, awareness forced accountability, and accountability forced a choice that fame rarely encourages, whether to keep performing stability or to start living honestly. That choice did not erase the past. It reframed it. The cost of never slowing down is not always collapse. More often, it is disconnection, subtle, cumulative, and easy to miss while life looks successful. Disconnection from emotion, from presence, from relationships that require more than availability. Brad Pitt's shift was not dramatic, it was deliberate. He did not walk away from work, he redefined his relationship to it. He did not abandon ambition. He replaced urgency with intention. He did not lose relevance, he loosened his dependence on it. That distinction matters. Because slowing down did not end his life. It made it inhabitable. This story challenges a powerful cultural belief that speed equals success and stopping equals failure. Pitt's journey suggests the opposite. That real stability comes from alignment, not acceleration, from knowing when motion is growth and when it is avoidance. Addiction, in this context, was not the story's center. It was the signal. The point where the cost of constant momentum became undeniable. The moment where slowing down stopped being optional and became necessary. And necessity, when honored, becomes wisdom. Brad Pitt's life now reflects something rarely celebrated: integration after acceleration. A willingness to live with less noise, fewer distractions, and more presence. A choice to accept limits without resentment. A recognition that slowing down is not retreat, it is repair. If this story changed how you see fame, not as protection, but as pressure, then it has done its work. If it made you question the cost of constant productivity, that matters even more. And if you want more long-form documentaries that explore the hidden psychology behind celebrity, success, and power, beyond headlines and spectacle, stay with this channel. Subscribe for thoughtful, in-depth stories, turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next, and share this video with someone who believes slowing down means losing everything, because sometimes slowing down is the only way to keep what matters.